Emily Brooks reached for her phone as it buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from her husband, Tom, who had been away on a business trip for the past few days. Unlocking the screen, she read his text. "The business here is done. I'm on my way back now. A table for dinner is reserved at 7 p.m. at the restaurant. See you there. Happy anniversary." There were no sweet words or affectionate emojis in the message, but that didn't surprise Justine. For some reason, Tom had been acting distant lately. She quickly replied, "See you. Happy anniversary. I love you," and set the phone back down, waiting for any kind of response. A few moments passed, and the screen stayed silent. She sighed, realizing she had just enough time to prepare for dinner. With that, she climbed out of bed and headed for the bathroom to shower and get ready. "Who was that?" asked Ryan Harris, the man who had been lying beside her for the past few hours. "My husband," Justine answered flatly. "He's letting me know he's on his way back. He already reserved a table for dinner tonight. It's our 5th anniversary." "Your 5th anniversary, huh?" Jake said, raising an eyebrow. "I thought you said he was back east?" "He was," she explained. "Apparently, he finished his work earlier than planned. I need to call my mom and check if she can watch little Jacob a bit longer." Jake smirked. "All right, but maybe you should come back to bed first. We could give Tom a little anniversary surprise." Justine rolled her eyes and laughed softly. "I'd love to, Jake, but I really need to get ready. I don't have much time. Thankfully, I've got clean clothes here. No way I'm meeting Tom in these wrinkled, stained ones." "Do you think he knows about us?" Jake asked, his tone shifting to something more serious. She shook her head confidently. "No, I don't think so. Lately, he's been so wrapped up in work. It's like he's living in another world. He barely even notices me or the baby." "How long do you plan on keeping him in the dark?" Jake pressed. Justine shrugged. "Hard to say. He's a good provider, and I know he'd be an amazing father if he actually tried. But he's so distracted. I don't think he even realizes that little Jacob isn't his." "And if he does?" Jake asked, watching her closely. "If he knows, he hasn't said a word," she replied. "I can't imagine he'd let something like that slide without confronting me." Jake leaned back with a sly grin. "Well, you know where to find me if you need anything." Justine smiled, glancing at him as she got up to grab a dress from the closet. It struck her how much of her wardrobe was here, in Jake's place, instead of at home with her husband. She picked out a blue dress, one with a deep neckline that fell just above the knee. She paused for a moment, trying to remember if Tom had seen her wear it before. If he hadn't, she could always claim it was new. After a quick call to her mother to confirm she could watch the baby, Justine took a long, hot shower. She wanted to wash away any trace of Jake before meeting Tom. She had promised herself when the affair began 16 months ago that she would never let her husband touch her while she still carried Jake's essence. It was her one rule, a line she refused to cross. Jake used to respect it, but ever since little Jacob was born, he had started pushing her to change her stance. She had stood firm, calling it crude and disrespectful, even as guilt gnawed at the edges of her mind. Once she was out of the shower, she brushed her long, dark hair until it fell just right, slipped into the blue dress, and applied her makeup with care. Satisfied that she looked and smelled good enough to meet Tom's standards, she kissed Jake goodbye and said, "See you tomorrow at the office." "Office?" Jake asked, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Of course, darling," she said with a playful smirk. "But tonight duty calls." She grabbed her purse and left his apartment without a second glance. Across town, Ben Brooks sat in his black Escalade, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. He glanced at the photo sent to him moments earlier by one of the private detectives he'd hired. It showed Justine leaving Jay Carter's luxury condo, wearing a blue dress that Tom had never seen before. Tom wasn't surprised. He had been back east, just as Justine thought, but he'd returned a day early after receiving an urgent call about a critical breach in one of his security systems. The voice on the other end had been clear. "If you don't fix this, we will." He had spent the following day in the intimidating presence of a man known only as Alpha One, a shadowy figure who operated far beyond the realm of ordinary law. "You have a problem, Waters," Alpha had said, his gravelly voice sharp as a blade. "And when you have a problem, we all do. Fix it quietly or I will." Tom had nodded, knowing there was only one acceptable answer. He also knew Alpha One's reputation for eliminating problems without hesitation. The stories he'd heard, about entire estates wiped clean of their occupants, made his stomach churn. For years, Justine had thought Tom was just a traveling salesman, installing security systems across the country. That much was true, but the systems he sold were equipped with technology that funneled critical data back to Alpha One's organization. Tom's work wasn't just about sales, it was about surveillance and control. And the problem Alpha had referred to wasn't the breach in his systems, it was Justine. For nearly 18 months, she had been having an affair with Jay Carter, one of the senior partners at the law firm where she worked as a paralegal. By the time Tom discovered the truth, Justine was already pregnant. A lawyer had warned him that no judge would grant a divorce while she was expecting, especially if there was any chance the baby could be his. Tom had clenched his jaw and endured the charade until Jacob was born. A paternity test soon confirmed what he had suspected. The child wasn't his. Now, as he waited for Justine to arrive at the restaurant, Tom took a final drag from his cigarette and crushed it in the ashtray. He grabbed his briefcase and headed inside, nodding at the two agents stationed near the entrance. Seated in a corner booth, he watched as Justine walked through the door, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. He stood as she approached. "Good evening, Justine," he said, his voice steady. "You look lovely tonight. Besides your lover Ryan Harris, the man you named Jacob after, how else could I have gotten his DNA?" Justine asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Tom leaned back in his seat and gave a cold smile. "It wasn't hard. You brought him home at least 3 nights a week. But that's not the only evidence." He reached into his briefcase and dropped a thick folder onto the table. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. "A detailed collection of every email, text, and electronic message you've exchanged with Jake over the last 16 months. Hate to break it to you, Justine, but privacy doesn't really exist online." Her face paled as she fumbled for words. "All right," she said, swallowing hard. "I admit it. Jake and I messed around. But it was just one time. It didn't mean anything. It was just sex." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? If it was nothing, then go ahead and turn to page 75. Scroll about halfway down to the passage I've highlighted. Read it out loud." Reluctantly, Justine flipped through the pages, her hands shaking as she found the section he referenced. Her face turned ashen as her eyes scanned the damning words she'd written. "I'm reading it," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "No," Tom said coldly. "I don't want you to just read it silently. I want to hear you say the words you wrote to him, out loud." Her gaze darted between the page and Tom's unyielding stare. "Please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't make me do this." Tom's expression hardened. "Either you read it or I will. And if I read it, I won't care who hears." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she glanced back at the page and began to speak, her voice trembling. "I love what you do to me, Jake. I've never felt as wonderfully satisfied as I have in the last 16 months. I can't wait for you to knock me up with another baby. I love your size more than Tom's, and I can't wait for the next time you can fill me up." When she finished, her head hung low, as if the weight of her own words was too much to bear. "In all the years we've been married, Justine," Tom said quietly, "I don't think you've ever spoken to me like that." Her voice was shaky as she asked, "Is that all you've got?" Tom chuckled bitterly. "Oh, not even close. I've got photos, audio, and hours upon hours of video." "You must really hate me," Justine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Tom replied without hesitation. The simplicity of his answer hit her like a physical blow. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. "How long have you known?" "I started suspecting before you told me you were pregnant," he said flatly. "So I dug a little deeper, gathered enough evidence to satisfy our prenuptial agreement. But by the time I was ready to confront you, you announced the pregnancy. My lawyer made it clear no judge would grant a divorce until after the baby was born. And now that little Jacob is here, I have everything I need to proceed." Tom gestured toward a nearby table, where two individuals who had been watching their exchange now stood and approached. The man carried a heavy envelope and set it down in front of Justine. "Miss Emily Brooks?" the man asked. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've been served," he said, placing the envelope on the table. "Served?" Justine's voice cracked as tears streamed down her face. Tom nodded, sliding a pen toward her. "Divorce papers. They're exactly as outlined in our prenuptial contract. Sign them, and I'll give you a cashier's check for $2,394, the exact amount you had when we got married. Don't ask for anything more. And before you start scheming, I already know about your little secret slush fund. You can keep that. All your belongings have been delivered to your mother's house. Yes, she knows, and yes, she's disappointed in you. She agreed to let you stay there, for the boy's sake, not yours." "I don't want a divorce," Justine said, her voice desperate. "I love you." "Please, Justine," Tom said sharply, his tone full of disdain. "Don't insult my intelligence." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he played a recording of her conversation with Jake from earlier that day. Justine's eyes widened as her own voice filled the space between them. How did you get that?" she stammered. "Well," Tom said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, "I could tell you, but then I'd have to shoot you. And as much as I despise you right now, I wouldn't deprive little Jacob of his mother." His smile was cold and devoid of any warmth. "I was nothing more than a meal ticket and a babysitter for you, while Jacob's real father got to enjoy the perks. Well, guess what? Your free ride is over." Justine's hands trembled as she asked, "What about Jake?" "Ah, worried about Daddy, are you?" Tom's smirk grew darker. "Jake's in for a world of trouble. Did you know we live in a state where I can sue him for alienation of affection? He's being served right now. It might not amount to much, but it's the principle of the thing. And that's just the beginning of his problems." Justine stared at him, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" "I mean his clients, Justine. Do you even know who he really represents? What he's actually doing when he's not shoving you into his mattress?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "He doesn't talk to me about that." "Good," Tom said grimly. "The less you know, the safer you'll be. Let's just say Jake has some very interesting clientele. The kind that attracts attention from certain federal agencies. Agencies that don't just ruin lives. They erase them." "You're scaring me," she said, her voice trembling. "You should be scared," Tom replied coldly. "Ryan Harris is going down, and if you're anywhere near him when it happens, you're going down too." She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you, Tom? Who are you really?" He gave her a tight smile, nodding toward the divorce papers. "Sign the papers, Justine. End this farce right now. I've already told you more than I should. Oh, and by the way, your credit card has been canceled, and your house key won't work anymore. I changed the locks this morning." "You were with Jake," Tom said, his voice cold and steady. "I've also made sure to take care of the joint bank account. You no longer have access to it. Not that it should matter, considering you've been quietly funneling half your earnings into your secret stash." Justine's face twisted with a mix of anger and defeat. "You knew everything, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom shrugged, his expression indifferent. With trembling hands, Justine looked over the divorce papers. As she skimmed through them, she realized they were exactly as Tom had described. Resigned, she picked up the pen, signed her name, and slid it back toward him. Tom smiled faintly as he took the pen and carefully reviewed the documents. The process server nearby stepped forward to witness the signatures, while the woman accompanying him notarized the papers with practiced efficiency. The man addressed Tom. "I'll make sure these reach your lawyer, Mr. Waters." "Thank you," Tom replied curtly. Once the pair left, Tom turned his attention back to Justine. His voice was calm but unyielding. I think you should hand over your rings now. Her eyes widened. Do I have to? I love these rings, she protested, clutching at her left hand. Not enough to stay out of Ryan Harris's bed, Tom shot back. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reluctantly slid the rings off her fingers and placed them on the table. Tom pocketed them without hesitation before leaning back in his chair. I believe our business here is finished, he said flatly. That's it? That's all you have to say? Justine asked, her voice shaking with emotion. Why? Why did you do this tonight on our anniversary? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me? Tom's jaw tightened as he stared at her, his voice low and measured. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was for me? Finding out you were deceiving me all this time? Learning that Jacob isn't my son? And then discovering you were sleeping with Carter on our anniversary? Don't you dare try to guilt-trip me, Justine. We're done. Completely done. Goodbye. With those words, he turned back to his meal, ignoring her as she wiped her tear-streaked face. The waitress approached hesitantly. Is everything all right here? Tom smiled politely, as if nothing was amiss. Yes, thank you. The meal is excellent, as always. I'll settle the bill, but I believe the lady will be taking her meal to go. The waitress nodded awkwardly. Yes, sir. I'll get a takeout box. She disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a styrofoam container. Carefully, she packed Justine's leftovers while Tom handed over his credit card to pay for the meal. Justine silently gathered her things. When the waitress finished, she turned to Tom. That's it? That's really it? Tom glanced up from his plate. That's it, he said firmly, waving her off. She stared at him, her disbelief evident. I'm sorry, Tom. I really am, she said, her voice breaking. Tom's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. Well, that's something we can both agree on, he said evenly. Now have a good day. Say hello to your mother for me. Oh, and happy anniversary. Unable to believe the casual way in which her husband had dismissed her, Justine ran from the table, tears streaming down her face. Tom watched her go before turning back to his meal. He noticed a few nearby patrons glancing at him with disapproval, but he simply smiled and shrugged. Outwardly, he was the picture of calm composure. Inwardly, though, he was shattered. 5 years of marriage, gone just like that. But at least now, he thought, the worst was behind him. The next few days passed without incident. It wasn't easy. Tom had once deeply loved Justine, and the memory of that love made it painful to treat her so harshly. Still, he believed it was better to confront her with cold efficiency than to unleash the anger he had bottled up inside. Then came the knock at his door. Tom was upstairs in the master bedroom when he heard it. Glancing out the window, he saw a sleek sports car in the driveway. He instantly recognized it as Ryan Harris's. Tom had suspected something like this might happen, which was why he'd upgraded his home security system at Alpha One's insistence. He made his way downstairs and opened the door. Jake barged in, his face flushed with fury. You son of a... You cost me my job. And Justine won't even talk to me. Jake roared. I'm going to kill you, you piece of... Jake's tirade was cut short as he advanced toward Tom. Suddenly, 15 small red laser dots appeared on Jake's chest. A robotic voice echoed from hidden speakers. Alert! Intrusion detected. Do not move. What the hell is this? Jake shouted, panic flashing across his face. He raised his hands as if to swat away the dots. A sharp thwip sound followed, and Jake looked down to see 15 darts embedded in his chest. His expression shifted from rage to confusion as his body began to sag. He tried to lift a hand, but his limbs failed him. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. Tom crouched down and looked at the limp figure. Doesn't look like you'll be killing anyone today, Carter, he said calmly. He pulled out his phone, tapped an icon, and spoke. Operator 1211. Cleanup needed in Zone 15. The response was immediate. Understood. Moments later, the security system retracted into the walls, leaving no trace of its presence. Tom stood, satisfied. Within minutes, an unmarked white van arrived. Men in Tyvek suits filed into the house, dragging Jake's limp body outside. One of them grabbed Jake's car keys and drove the vehicle away. The operation was swift and precise, leaving no evidence behind. As the van disappeared down the street, Tom closed the door and returned to his routine.